Welcome to Food Revolution Conversations, where we explore healthy, ethical, and sustainable food for all.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Ocean Robbins, and I am thrilled to bring you this special interview event right now with Leah Penniman, who is the co-founder and co-director of Soulfire Farm. Leah has over 20 years of experience as a soil steward and food sovereignty activist. She's worked at the Food Project, Farm School, Many Hands Organic Farm, Youth Grow, and with farmers internationally in Ghana, Haiti, and Mexico. In 2010, Leah co-founded Soulfire Farm as a Black and Indigenous and people of color-centered community farm committed to ending racism and injustice in the food system. She is the author of Farming While Black, Soulfire Farm's practical guide to liberation on the land. She's one of the leading voices in the grassroots movement for food justice. And I also am just so honored to have this time. I just want to speak personally for a moment. I founded Food Revolution Network with my dad in 2012, and we're committed to healthy, ethical, and sustainable food for all. And we've been continuing that mission, reaching millions of people. And one of the things that keeps coming up again and again in our work is that in order to be true to the for all part of our mission takes proactive intention. Because there is something of an apartheid right now in the world of food. Not everybody has access to the same resources, the same farms, the same agricultural capacities, the same financial resources. And when you look at it statistically, there is this huge divide. And statistically, the darker your skin color in the United States today, the more likely you are to depend for the majority of your calories on unhealthy food. And we want to change that. And Leah wants to change that. And she is changing that. We're all changing that. And we're here today to talk about that, to talk about what we can do and how we can be a part of transformation, healing, love, justice, wellness for everyone. Leah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your awareness and commitment to really making food accessible for all people, which is certainly what we stand for at Soulfire. So thank you.
Absolutely. You know, your book, Farming While Black, which is wonderful, by the way, everyone should get a copy. It's dedicated to the African ancestors who, before boarding slave ships, braided seeds into their hair. And when I read that, I felt the chill go through my body. I want to ask you, how do those African ancestors inform the work that you do today?
Yeah, thank you for calling in the ancestors. You know, whenever I go out into the field each morning, I always call on the memory of my grandma's grandma, whose name is Susie Boyd, and she is one of the 12.5 million African people who were kidnapped from the shores of West Africa, forced onto slave ships and forced to do the agricultural labor unpaid that built the multi-trillion-dollar wealth that's foundational to this country. And yeah, she had that audacious courage and foresight to gather up her millet, her okra, her cowpea, her black rice, right, and braid it into her hair as insurance, and in belief that descendants would exist to inherit that seed. So the way that informs my work on the day-to-day is I think about, you know, if my ancestors had the fortitude in the face of really unimaginable horror, you know, watching their babies and cousins get snatched up and not knowing when they'd be next, if they had that courage to save seed for these descendants they hadn't met yet, then who am I to give up on my own descendants, right? Even in these really trying times. And so both physically and metaphorically, I sort of take that seed that my ancestors have passed down, put it in the ground, save it for the next generation. And those seeds are in the form of okra and cowpea, right? As well as in the form of the farmer training that we do, the organizing that we do for more just policies.
Thank you. You know, it's occurring to me that the legacy of farming as practiced in the industrialized world is so interwoven with racism and injustice and exploitation of the land, of animals, and of course of human beings. And, you know, the primary driver of slavery was agricultural. And today, treatment of farm workers is pretty deplorable, you know, in the United States. The life expectancy for farm workers in the state of California, where I live, by one estimate, is 49 years. Rates of cancer are off the charts because of all the pesticide exposure in the fields. And it occurs to me that the act of growing food can be something we reclaim, that it doesn't have to be something that's rooted in exploitation and domination and harm and injurious action. It can become something beautiful. And that's what I see you doing.
Well, thank you for saying that. As you mentioned, labor, it's 85% Latinx and Hispanic people growing the food who are not protected by the same labor laws as other Americans, while being a farm manager is among the whitest professions. And then, as you mentioned, of course, food apartheid, who gets to eat the food?
Right.
If you're white in this country, you're 4 times more likely to have a healthy supermarket in your neighborhood. And that's why we work so hard on that. Both on the tangible grassroots level, where we're literally growing food and delivering it at low and no cost to the doorsteps of people under food apartheid, growing community gardens in urban spaces, but also on the policy level. And so we have a land trust that returns land to Indigenous people and to other dispossessed farmers. We have a regional fund, right, that accepts money and then distributes no interest loans and grants to new and beginning farmers. And so these are some of the sort of the macro ways that we're looking to redistribute some of the resources that were stolen through, generations of slavery, sharecropping, and other forms of land-based oppression.
Yeah, thank you for that so much. There's a lot here. We could go into the policies, the politics, the practices, how it is that we went from 14% of the farmers in America being African American to 2% in the last century. The way that the USDA recently settled a massive lawsuit for preferential loan treatment, basically discrimination against African American farmers, which made it harder for them to keep their farms over the last century. And of course, we also have the accessibility issues, right? We have what some call food deserts. I don't know if you use that term. I know it's somewhat controversial, but there's no denying the fact that I think it was the New York Law School Racial Justice Project said 23.5 million people in the US live in low-income neighborhoods located more than a mile from a supermarket. Mostly we're talking about urban settings here. So being more than a mile from a supermarket is significant and odd given the population density. That Black communities are half as likely to have access to large supermarkets as white communities of similar population density, right? And they're more likely to be dependent on liquor stores and 7-Elevens and small scale places that stock up on the junk food, right? That is then causing heart disease and type 2 diabetes and obesity and so many other health ailments, right? And so I'm curious, when you look at that dynamic and you ask the question, what can we do to address it, to bring some opportunity and access into those communities? First of all, what are the challenges that we're up against? And second of all, what can we do?
Absolutely. And, we don't use the term food desert, even though it's useful to understand the term, because it is how the government describes a zip code that's both low income and is between 1 and 10 miles from a supermarket, depending on the population density. The challenge with the term desert is that it implies a natural phenomena. It implies a beautiful ecosystem that arose through a natural process. Yeah. But in fact, there's nothing natural at all about certain people being relegated to food opulence and others to food scarcity, often on the lines of race. That's really apartheid. And there's, of course, a whole history to how that came to be. Housing discrimination through redlining, divestment in communities, urban renewal, gentrification, all of these systems at play that make your zip code one of the number one determiners of your life expectancy, again, often on race lines. So what can be done about it is systemic, and it's not a quick fix. We need to address the fact that housing discrimination has actually increased in this country since fair housing laws were passed in the 1970s. Actors go in, with the same credit score and resumes, but depending if they're Black or white, they're being shown properties or not. And then that determines the tax base, and that determines how much investment comes into communities. But I think also, there are really beautiful models to look at. For example, in Detroit, out of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, they actually not only formed a 7-acre urban farm, but they formed a co-op, a grocery store that is owned by and run by the residents in the communities impacted by food apartheid. And so how do we as a society learn to actually trust the leadership of the people most impacted by these harms, and invest in the institutional infrastructure for us to lead and solve our own problems? You know, that co-op should have the Kellogg grants, the Ford Foundation grants. You know, it should have all the support that it needs to get off the ground. And right now it's using GoFundMe, right, in order to establish its basic renovations that it needs. And that's ridiculous, because if a community is coming together to solve these really entrenched racial issues, systemic issues, then we need to be 100% behind it. And so, you know, all of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, Detroit Co-op, they need to be funded.
Yeah, absolutely. What about school lunches, school meal programs? More than 30 million kids depend on them for some part of their food survival. They're not exactly known for offering the healthiest options. They're under-resourced dramatically. They're often dependent on commodities crops that are given essentially surplus by the USDA for little to no charge in order to meet the caloric needs, but not the nutritional needs necessarily of the students in their care. But some people worry that if schools do provide healthier options, the students may not actually want them, because if they just put a bunch of kale out there, the students may just go for the French fries, right, and not eat the kale. So how do we address creating the education, the demand, the interest? Is it about making more culturally appropriate, recognizable foods? Is it about school food service programs getting better at preparation? Is it about education in the classrooms? How do we cross that bridge?
That's a really good question. So yes, it is about preparation of that food, being high quality. It's about fully funding the program. I mean, with $1 or $2 per kid per lunch and these entrenched contracts with Aramark and Sodexo, there's no way that you're actually going to get good vegetables into the kitchen. So we need to be able to really divorce our city contracts from these large corporate aggregators. And the HEAL Food Alliance, HEAL, Health, Environment, Ag, and Labor, is working on a Real Food and Real Meals campaign around this to get cities to break up with, to really divorce from these big companies and be able to source locally. And then, yeah, having young people actually involved in food preparation in terms of bringing in recipes, getting in the kitchen. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, we have thousands of young people come through Soul Fire Farm every year, and they all eat the food because they grew it, they cooked it, they participated. So the idea that somehow, you know, Black and brown folks need to be educated to eat right is really a smokescreen. It's not the issue. It's about resourcing really good meals for our young people.
Yeah, I do find that growing food and preparing food is the best way to incite appetite for that food. We have teenagers, I know you do too, and you know, when they are involved in preparing a meal or planting anything in the garden or harvesting it, they're so much more likely to eat it. And there's a certain joy that comes from that feeling of connection to what we're eating. And it strikes me that part of what you're doing is helping people to reclaim their relationship to food itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's some really powerful work out there. For example, the Heritage Foodways organization does some work creating food pyramids that are based on indigenous and ancestral foodways. And there are wonderful authors out there, you know, like Mike Twitty and Bryant Terry, who are also, you know, uplifting our ancestral foodways, because there can be a myth out there that, you know, white people, you know, that eat that quote healthy food, and that like our foods as Black people are all fried and unhealthy, but it's actually not the case. You know, the basis of a West African traditional diet is legumes, tubers, green vegetables, fish, and a lot of spices. And so finding ways to connect to that and really reach back beyond the time when our diets were very colonized by both corporations and also slave masters, to be frank. And reclaim those heritage foodways is super important. And kids are so excited about that. They're so excited to cook those foods. And if you spice it properly, you know, it tastes good. It's just that some people don't know how to use spice. So,
you know, what you're saying is striking a chord in me right now when you just named the foods, the traditional staples of the West African diet. I'm thinking about how healing it is, how restorative it is for us to reshape our identity as human beings. that we all have roots in a way of living, a way of feeding ourselves that is aligned with our well-being and the well-being of the planet. And however far estranged we may be, however far back into our ancestors when we may have to look to find those roots, I think that we have within our DNA something of the wisdom of everything all of our ancestors have ever experienced, and that lives in us. And it sort of gets to this core nature of what does it mean to be a human being? Because I've got to admit, sometimes I look at human beings, and as a white man, maybe this is a particular perspective I have, and I feel ashamed of what we do. I feel ashamed of how we treat animals. I feel ashamed of how we treat each other. I feel ashamed of how we treat the earth. And I feel ashamed of how we produce food and have turned it into a commodity that's exploitive and destructive and extractive. And at the same time, I believe that there's something, we're also capable of something else. And it strikes me that there is a wisdom in the ancestors, as I hear you speak of it, that we can draw upon to return ourselves into a greater alignment with who we really are.
I appreciate you saying that. And if folks don't listen to the Table Underground podcast, which is a really fun food justice podcast, there's an episode where Owen Taylor of True Love Seeds talks exactly about that, about how his Italian ancestors had to give up, right, their language, their culinary traditions, their religion, dialect, and really assimilate. And in the process, though, leave behind this wisdom. Yeah. And it made me think how important it is for European heritage folks, for all folks, talk to your grandparents, go back, read, pray, dream, and really try to connect to what it was before this project of domination took over the imagination of your people. Because we all have actually indigenous roots. If you go back far enough, I'm talking about, pre-conquest Europe, pre-conquest Africa, pre-conquest Asia. And how do we understand what it is to remember the source of that wisdom and try to start implementing that in our lives? So I really appreciate you saying that.
Thank you. Leah, what have you learned from farming, from soil, from the rhythms of nature, and how has it informed how you relate to the problems facing humanity?
That's a huge question. I would say there is nothing of value that I haven't learned from nature.
Yeah.
So I can talk about that a lot, but I'll say one lesson. I'm always like watching nature and trying to emulate, and biomimicry on the spiritual plane. But,
yeah,
something that most recently, Soul Fire Farm has gotten a lot of pressure to grow bigger or franchise or sort of create some strange empire of food justice, which is really weird. But I look at the forest, right? And if there's a pine tree on the edge of the forest that's getting a lot of sunlight, she doesn't actually grow 6 times taller than all the other trees. She takes those extra sugars and minerals and dumps them into a web of mycelium, fungal hyphae, to share with the other pine trees and non-pine trees all throughout the forest, so that they're all fortified and they can have their mast year together. And so if one is weak, the others hold her up, right? And so I think about appropriate growth of organizations, of movements, as really being this translocal, dispersed mutuality web of interdependence, and not so much replicating a model of hierarchy and domination. And that's something that our model of growth as an organization and a movement is really modeled after the way the forest shares its resources. We want to be a superorganism like the forest.
Beautiful. If someone doesn't grow a ton of food or become a true farmer, do you think that growing anything, planting any seed still changes their life in some way?
Absolutely. And even if you can't plant a seed, like make friends with a tree. Like I'm a big fan of literal tree hugging. Your exhale becomes the tree's inhale. But yeah, you can grow sprouts on your kitchen counter. You can grow a little salad garden with turnip greens and lettuce and scallions right on your windowsill. You could even grow a pepper in a pot on your balcony. And so I really am a big proponent of starting small with whatever space you have. And that relationship of watching your plant every day, nurturing it and encouraging it, I think awakens a part of us that has been asleep and that we all need to be in touch with. So I encourage anyone and everyone to grow something if you can.
Beautiful. One of the places a lot of people are growing food is in community gardens and school gardens. And yet often we find that in urban communities, the soil is contaminated with lead and other heavy metals. Is there anything we can do about that so that it's safe to eat that food?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, and this is very personal to me because when we were living in Worcester, Massachusetts, and had our first child, Nashima, she was lead poisoned from a community garden. And we didn't find out until
Oh,
her 1 year checkup, and of course did
wow.
all the things a parent would do to help their child. But as activists also started to think about what about the million other children in this city, and went around testing soils and doing remediation. We started a youth co-op called Toxic Soil Busters that's still doing remediation. So all that to say, there are a few options. Probably the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest thing to do if you're either unsure about your soils or you have soils that are contaminated with lead levels, is to build a raised bed. You can just use some, pine will last a couple years. If you have access to hemlock, it'll last 4 or 5 years. Build a raised bed, fill it with clean compost or topsoil or a mix, with a weed barrier at the bottom, and grow right into that, and just make sure that the pathways are covered with wood chips. If you're ambitious and willing to do a little bit of studying, you can actually phytoremediate using plants like geranium, sunflower, mustard. It can be a 1 to 3 year process to get those plants to actually clean the soil. And it requires cordoning off the area to keep it safe while you're doing the remediation, and really some training. But that's something that we did in certain areas, and we're able to get lead levels down from, around 2000 to under 400, which is considered safe enough to grow in.
Do the plants just take in the lead and then you have to consider them toxic, or do they actually transform it in some way?
They take in the lead. So lead and arsenic are elements. So they actually can't be broken down through a normal chemical process, only through an atomic process. And plants, unfortunately, are not atomic, don't have that power to degrade atoms. So they are just moving it into the body of the plant. The plant becomes toxic then and needs to be disposed of and moved into a safe, lined landfill. Where it's not going to seep out into the environment. Hydrocarbons, organic materials, including oil, plastics even, can actually be degraded by some fungi, algae, and plants because they can break down their compounds rather than elements. Again, probably beyond the scope of this podcast, but if you're a nerd like me and you like chemistry, there's a lot to learn out there.
Great. So if some of our audience want to help contribute to healthy, ethical, sustainable food for all, if they want to especially maybe make a positive impact or make a contribution or be in right relation to marginalized communities, what are some of the top things they can do?
Well, the good news, as my daughter says, the food system is everything it takes to get sunshine onto your plate. So it's such a wide arc. There's lots of points of intersection and lots of right answers. A couple of sort of easy things you could do right now is on the soulfirefarm.org website. There is a reparations map, which contains Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led food and farming projects all across the country. You can look on that map, find a project near you, and see what it is they need. It might be volunteer work, it might be money, land, but try to support your local BIPOC-led organizations. Another thing you can find at soulfirefarm.org is an action guide that has a whole bunch of policies and bills that need to be passed into law in order to protect farm workers, to return land to Indigenous people, to protect Black farmers from losing more land, and so forth. And so please do call your congressperson, tell them that you support this legislation, and that can be really, really helpful. And of course, donate to Black and brown-led organizations. It's all the lists are all over the internet right now, but we have our own list as well at Soulfire Farm of orgs that need support. So that's how you can pitch in.
Now, Soulfire, SOUL, firefarm.org. You also have a capital campaign, and could you tell us a little bit about that and how people might be able to contribute if they want to step forward in a bold way to carry your work forward into the future?
Oh, thank you for bringing that up. I was going to forget about it, but so Soulfire Farm, despite its national reach, even international, some would say, operates out of the living room of a single family home and has thousands of people coming through for training programs. So recently the county health department said, this is no longer cute. You all need to build commercial buildings so that you have, up to fire code and ADA and health regulations and so forth. So we're in the process of raising money and building these buildings so that we can continue to operate and even expand our farmer training programs, which have a multi-year waiting list. And it's very exciting because my partner Jonah is a master builder, so everything is, you know, straw bale, timber frames, natural plasters, renewable energy, and we're even accepting clay soil from our alumni to put into the natural plasters, so everyone's land will be a part of these buildings. So yeah, again, go to our website, soulfirefarm.org, if you want to pitch in for the capital campaign and help us continue to grow the next generation of Black farmers for years to come.
Wonderful. My wife and I are proud donors to Soulfire Farm. I think this work is so important. I am so grateful to you for your courage, for your truth-telling, for your willingness to embrace so many painful realities with such dignity and love. And the smile and the joy that comes through in your work is so magnificent. I think it takes a special being to hold the span, to face the darkness and the pain and the violence and the violations of humanity, and also to continue to be a beacon and a stand for the love, the joy that is possible and that is real in all of us. I thank you, Leah, so much for who you are, for what you do, for the stand you take, and really for lighting a way for all of us to see a way forward that is worthy of who we are as human beings.
Thank you so much. And love is truly the only answer to society's problems. So thank you for affirming that. And I wish you all the best with your endeavors.
And you as well.